welcome everyone, the panelists to Chronic Life, Can We Go the Distance with the Virus, and the participants in the webinar who we are not seeing on our screen at the moment. But thank you everyone for joining us. On behalf of the Zip Code Memory Project, I want to especially welcome you to this session. The Zip Code Memory Project has been going for about 1.5 years. We are seeking to find reparative ways to memorialize the devastating losses resulting from the coronavirus pandemic, but also acknowledging its radically differential effects on Upper New York City neighborhoods and other neighborhoods. We were working across zip codes of Harlem, Washington Heights, and the South Bronx. We were gathered with local community, arts, and academic organizations, and we were trying to imagine how the losses of the pandemic could be acknowledged, mourned, and healed, and how the mutual aid, care, and repair that they have occasioned can be honored. We met as a group throughout last year for a series of workshops that engaged the memory of our ongoing experiences with COVID, with artists, writers, performers, and community participants throughout the year. This culminated in an exhibition entitled Imagine Repair at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and a short documentary film called Together, Not Alone, that's in development by Judith Helfand and Gabriela Canal. Today, we also had a series of webinars, and today is one more in that series. You can read more about the Zip Code Memory Project on our website, zcmp.org, where you'll also find the recordings of the other webinars. On behalf of my colleagues in the Zip Code Memory Project, Professor Marianne Hirsch, Professor Lori Novak, Professor Diana Taylor, and photographer Susan Mycelis, I want to welcome you today. I'm Laura Wexler. I'm the professor of American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University and co-chair of Yale Public Humanities. And I'm the co-moderator of today's roundtable, along with Aylin Perez, who's a postdoctoral associate in the Department of History at Yale and Yale's Public Humanities Fellow. The pandemic is far from over. Vaccination, as we have found, is far from perfect. Long COVID is a significant threat. Politics is playing hardball with all our lives. We are unprepared for the horizon of other viruses, or underprepared, I should say. The consequences of all of this are vastly unequally distributed, and we are very likely to be anxious, in denial, and puzzled about how best to respond. In this roundtable, 4 prominent artists and scholars will present art and organizing strategies drawn from lived experience with chronic illness, community activism, and the personal and political demands that long hauling presents. Speaking personally, I've been very interested in this topic for very many years, and so not really since the very first reports of the new virus in December of 2019, but way before that. When I was a graduate student, I was lucky to take a year-long seminar with Dr. Oliver Sacks, who was at that point just finishing his book, Awakenings, which he published in 1973. The book was about his experience at the Beth Abraham long-term care home, treating the survivors of the World War I era flu epidemic, who subsequently were stricken with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism and lived for decades in the semi-comatose state. Sacks in 1969 experimentally gave his patients at Beth Abraham the new drug L-Dopa, and over a period of weeks, their stupors lifted, and for a while, they had motion and speech and communication and interaction with the world returned to them. And then tragically, L-Dopa slowly wore off and they were returned to their post-encephalitic Parkinson's state. And I knew from this, and you know this from the film, the movie, and the book, you know this, I knew that there were consequences to mass viral illnesses that were very serious, and that not only the 1919 flu, but the current pandemic had the possibility of leaving a devastating imprint behind. I was also aware that it took a storyteller as great as Sachs to get the public to pay attention to this. And I've been interested that it is taking artists as distinguished as the ones we will talk to today to focus, to fill in, to challenge, to color our understanding and imagination so that we too can understand where we are with the sequelae of COVID, which is the long haul of the virus, and how we now walk with it into a better future. So that was my inspiration behind this panel. I'm so thrilled that the people who are here accepted that invitation. Let me turn to introduce the first pair of people who will talk to us. Dr. Alexandra Juhas is a distinguished professor of film at Brooklyn College, CUNY. She makes and studies committed media practices that contribute to political change and individual and community growth. She is the author or editor of scholarly books on AIDS, including AIDS TV, and we are having this conversation now, The Times of AIDS Cultural Production, with Ted Kerr, who is her co-panelist when that book is about to come out from Duke. She has written about fake and real documentaries, a book with Nissan Shah and Ganel Langlois called Really Fake, Learning from YouTube from MIT Press, Black lesbian filmmaking, with Yvonne Welbon, Sisters in the Life, 25 Years of African-American Lesbian Filmmaking. She is the producer of educational videotapes on feminist issues from AIDS to teen pregnancy, as well as feature fake documentaries, The Watermelon Woman with Cheryl Dunier and The Owls, also with Cheryl Dunier. She writes about her cultural and political commitments in scholarly and more public platforms, including Hyperallergic, Bomb, and more. Her edited anthology of community-produced poetry about fake news, My Phone Lies to Me, is being published this fall by Punctum Press. Theodore Ted Kerr is an educator, writer, and organizer. He is the co-author of We Are Having This Conversation Now, The Times of AIDS Cultural Production, that is about to come out in 2022. He curated the 2021 exhibition AIDS, Poster and Stories of Public Health, a People's Pandemic for the National Libraries of Medicine. He's a founding member of the collective What Would an HIV Doula Do? He was an oral historian for the visual arts in the AIDS epidemic, an oral history project for the Smithsonian Archives of American Art in 2017, 2018. Additionally, he's an adjunct instructor at the New School and Manhattan College. Alex and Ted, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is our pleasure to be here. Ted, would you like to begin on our behalf?
I would love to say hi, Alex. That's one way I'll start. It's nice to be in here with you too.
And hi, audience. And Laura, thank you for programming our book about the cultural history of AIDS with these two other books. It's a really exciting way to think about the work that we're doing in this larger conversation.
Yeah, so we're going to spend our 20 minutes pulling kind of the spine from our book in hopes that it'll be helpful and generative to the conversation that we're going to have. I'm going to start sharing a slide, and as I do, I'm going to start to describe the book, and then Alex, if you want to come in after me and maybe mention anything that I've forgotten or anything that you think the audience should know. So the first thing I want to say is that our book is called We're Having This Conversation Now, and it is coming out November 11th, 2022, and it is 13 short conversations that kind of track the stories and histories of the ongoing crisis of HIV/AIDS through cultural objects and personal conversations, and then is really an invitation to the reader to stop, reflect, act, archive, and feel. Anything to add, Alex?
Yes. So the beautiful piece of art on the cover, I think, really encapsulates a lot of the commitments of the book. And it's by the activist and artist Chloe Zabilo. And I would also say that this is our first time talking about the book in public. It took us 7 years to write, and it's very hard to write one book by yourself, but one book with another person has been an act of love and inspiration.
Yeah, and I would say that I think as much as our content is useful to today, I think our form as a pair is also hopefully helpful to the conversations we can have. So the book has 3 timelines. Each provides a way of tracking HIV/AIDS through time. And something that's really important, because we're going to go through one of the timelines, is that we offer the timelines to be helpful, not prescriptive. We understand that time is not a line. I'm going to switch to the next slide. Alex, do you want to do the first one?
Sure. So I think really just because we're now going to tell you what is sort of the most bite-worthy information of our book, how by thinking about all of the work that has been produced across this ongoing pandemic, we began to see these constellations of really what ends up being visibility and invisibility that map pretty neatly onto a timeline. And we found that helpful to begin to name extreme differences of affect and extreme differences, so internally, but also in community that we had lived through. So across the ongoing pandemic. And so these are the 6 periods that we name. And as you're listening, you can be challenging them and thinking about what falls inside and outside of them. They really aren't prescriptive. But before 1981 is the period that we call AIDS before AIDS. And this is to mark that HIV was circulating in the world from as early as 1900s. And we have proof, a lot of
That's the CDC calling.
Ted has done a lot of original research, as have other people, about evidence of AIDS circulating in the United States as early as the 1960s. And so what's important about the designation AIDS before AIDS is that although there was HIV in the world, yet to be known by that, there was no discourses circulating around it to produce a cultural, but also all of the other forms of care and also harm that occur once you start putting language onto a biological entity. You can go next.
And then that period, AIDS before AIDS, is followed by something that we call the first silence, which we think begins in 1981 with somebody like Dr. Gottlieb making a specific notice in a medical journal about the appearance of a then mysterious illness. So that's when the response begins. And we think it lasts until 1987. And there is a whole activity of work going on. There's people living with HIV and people who, an unknown mysterious illness, and people who care about them who are doing this work, but it's primarily done in isolation. And a lot of the efforts to coordinate these things are blocked by the Reagan administration. And the result is a once possibly manageable health crisis becomes an epidemic, and it's happening in what we call silence.
And again, because our scholarship is about cultural production and representation, part of what we're eager to think about is what do communities of impacted people and those who care for them need to do to push something that we already know into visualization, but also cultural production. And Laura told a story about that earlier. So sometimes you need very famous or very impactful storytellers, to be sure, but you also need activism and all of the lived experiences of many people to coalesce into what occurred for many of us in our lived memory. And of course, one of the things that Ted and I work on is how these are lived memories in our own bodies and our own communities. But because Ted and I are an intergenerational team, we were experiencing these decades or smaller moments in our timeline differently, because in 1987 to 1996, in the production of AIDS crisis culture, which I was involved in. I was a young graduate student living in New York City, and it's hard to imagine not being young, queer, an activist, someone living in New York City, and not understanding the onslaught of this crisis, not simply because we all knew people who were dying or were caring for people who were dying, but because the cultural representation around the lived reality of HIV reached an extraordinary crescendo because of the work of mainstream representation, small activist projects, protest, and all of the ways in which those then align with support and learn from the medical breakthroughs that we're hoping for in our communities, but medical breakthroughs not being the only things we're hoping for in our communities. So in AIDS crisis culture from 1986, most of the things that people now think about as like AIDS art or AIDS culture, the famous things, come from this period. And you'll see that we still learn from and return to those very important pieces of cultural production. But one of the things that we learned by thinking about AIDS crisis culture and what comes next, you can see what it will be, and Ted will describe it, is that as community coalesces, so does the magnificence of culture, and so does its power. And what is particularly important about AIDS crisis culture, and again, as someone who wrote my dissertation about AIDS activist video and made AIDS activist video, is that you're making it in a community and in dialogue, and you're making connections that fire you up. You learn from your colleagues, and you're inspired by what's around you. And so that produces this magnificent body of work. And also to remind you, if you weren't alive at this time, a period of extraordinary death, mourning, very sick people who weren't getting the care that they needed because of homophobia, racism, poverty, and sexism, which have always underlined our struggles around this virus. Ted?
Yeah, and for people living with HIV in the audience right now, for people deeply connected to HIV in the audience right now, and of course for scholars, the year 1996 holds such an important marker. It's the year that highly active antiretroviral therapy became available, and to use a colloquial phrase, HIV went from a death sentence to a quote unquote manageable illness. And that really did produce a totally new time. All of a sudden, AIDS was submerged back into silence. And here we should say that Alex and I don't think that silence is a lack of sound. It is the lack of connection between the sounds that are happening. So within the second silence, there is still new diagnosis. There are still sadly deaths. There is still art being made. There is still activism, but it's not coalescing and producing the kind of loudness that we saw in AIDS crisis culture. And this is not for lack of trying. This is in part because of the media walking away. This is because of geopolitical ideas of who counts and who doesn't. But the second silence impact on people like myself was that I was coming of age at a period where just when I needed AIDS information in my pleasure seeking, there was none available. There was only silence and some history. And then that leads us to the next phase.
And simply to bounce off of Ted's experience, the second silence for me was really different because it was this kind of extraordinary lull and absence where before, as a young woman in my 20s, I was in community talking about HIV all the time, learning about HIV all the time. And suddenly I would go to an AIDS event and no one would be there. It was a stunning indifference publicly in culture, but not an indifference for those who had HIV and not an indifference for those who were impacted by HIV. But there was also trauma in that time and healing, because people were now some people who had access to medication were being properly medicated for the first time. And I hope that you're thinking about these chapters in relationship to the slow but real parallels we can draw with COVID culture. And when we see it and when we don't, when it's dominant and when it's quiet, what are the forces that are pulling it in and out of cultural consciousness, whether that be mainstream media or activists or artists, it's a very short history, so maybe we can't even think about it as a history, but there's lessons to be learned in that regard here. So Ted and I meet in 2008 because Ted wants to interview me about this idea that he has called AIDS crisis revisitation, which was something that I was working on as well, parallel, many of us were in the community, because suddenly after this period of silence, of mourning, of gaps, of loss, of why am I the only one who thinks about this? A deluge, another moment of cultural production. And that is from 2008 till now. And again, we could have fun mapping for you how AIDS shows up everywhere suddenly again, starting in 2008. But one of the things that we noticed when we began to think about this together, first really politically, and then more so in this cultural investigation that we did together, was that it was almost always backward focused. It was almost always thinking about AIDS crisis culture. It often was characterized, at least in its beginning, because AIDS crisis revisitation has changed since 2008, to the sorrowful or heroic stories of gay white men who have been fundamentally impacted by HIV and continue to be, but often not paying attention to the other communities that have been so fundamentally impacted and also fundamentally committed to cultural production, whether that be women of color, people in the global South, trans women, and the impoverished in the United States, and so on. Those stories weren't rising to the surface as suddenly AIDS was becoming visible. And one of the things that is quite exciting to see in relationship to a politics of cultural production, and I will pass this over to Ted to talk about AIDS crisis normalization, is that the community itself began to respond and think about AIDS critically again, and began to produce a different kind of culture that was in conversation itself with AIDS crisis revisitation. So AIDS crisis revisitation continues. So, it's anything that wants to talk about AIDS by returning to AIDS crisis culture. There's lots of television shows on right now that do that. There's lots of revisits to great Broadway plays, films from that period. There's lots of people writing about their memories of that time. And we're not critical of that project, but we did want to name it. And one of the ways that I can say it isn't helpful for contemporary AIDS activists and people with AIDS currently, and the people who care for them, is that it does have a backward focus and tends to not allow us to think about how AIDS is with us at this moment and how we need to think about AIDS in 2022. And so that gets us to our sixth period, also contemporaneous with an ongoing AIDS crisis revisitation.
And something that, Alex, you helped illuminate for us in our process is that we could have never gotten to a period of AIDS normalization or AIDS crisis normalization without the revisitation. In order to be in the present, you helped us understand, was that we actually had to look back because of the damage that the silence did. There was like a gulf between in knowledge and in connection. So we needed to look back in order to even look at the present. And so we see normalization happening right now. Our knowledge of it is unfolding as we talk. This conversation is going to inform both of us on what we mean by AIDS crisis normalization. But basically what we know is that mentions of HIV/AIDS become more commonplace after 2016 and expected and present invested within US culture. So TV shows will talk about AIDS and it'll just be one part of the plot and not a whole special episode or something like that. And it becomes less connected to trauma for many people. But this is where we want to talk about this little nifty thing we're doing with the title. So you see that AIDS is in brackets. And it means that for a lot of people, it's just AIDS normalization. But for a lot of people, and mainly largely unheard people, the crisis remains. And that becomes really important. So the AIDS as crisis is present but less definitive, even as stigma, discrimination, criminalization organize the lives of some people living with HIV. And before we do a little bit of a reading for you, Alex, I think this is where we wanted to talk a little bit about the role that COVID plays in AIDS crisis normalization.
Sure. And before we get there, and we are kind of coming to a conclusion, I do want to acknowledge that AIDS crisis normalization or AIDS normalization has within it both aspects of fundamental empowerment for people who have HIV or live in communities that are impacted, and also burdens that can be quite difficult. So normalization in the sense of it's defanged of its radicality, or what becomes unwritten are the critiques of racism, capitalism, education, and all of the other things that keep people sick. We don't, that kind of normalization can be very painful if it's whitewashed. A kind of AIDS, a normalization that can feel empowering is when AIDS becomes something among many. So HIV is important to think about, as is COVID, as is poverty, as is access to healthcare, that AIDS is one and not the identifying problem, particularly as AIDS can be understood not necessarily only connected to gayness in the United States. And so AIDS ripples into our culture where it always has been. And that's a kind of normalization that, you know, many of us have been fighting for since the beginning of the crisis in the 80s. So last but not least, we noticed writing the book that COVID put a pressure on the representation of AIDS that we had not seen, in that it put AIDS into history. So when a new virus puts pressure on a virus that is still live in the culture, is still producing damage and harm, contemporary media began to want to learn from AIDS and learn from AIDS activism and learn from the patient-led activism and how, you know, medicine was investigated, how it was financed, you know. So suddenly AIDS is not just in the past, it is a fundamental piece of information that has been written into American history that is helping us with COVID. And that changes it, it normalizes it. And and also it's referred to all the time. So in all reporting about COVID, you suddenly are hearing reporting about AIDS as well. So it's been very interesting to hear the ways in which AIDS has been changed in the consciousness of mainstream, but also activist culture in the face of COVID.
Right,
and so
normalization is almost shocking because for both of us who had intense periods of silence around HIV/AIDS, for it to then be so casually yet vitally named was powerful, but just to add that word again, shocking.
And so we're gonna just read the conclusion of the book, but so here's one of the things that we talked about, seeing our book paired as it is. We said we didn't want to do this thing that, like, I was very often asked to do in the beginning of COVID. How is COVID like AIDS? That question. How is COVID, you know, how is AIDS like other COVID illnesses? That's you, Ted. So what we're excited about in this conversation is to hear the ways in which the work that those who have been living with, making art around, organizing around the lived experiences of the unhealthy or coming into healthy body, right? The ways that we can learn from each other. And we're excited to provide this slice of that conversation in an American context. But I will just add, and then we'll read the end, that I had COVID in March 2020, and I've been doing a lot of organizing with HIV activists around long COVID. And so those connections have also been made in my lived experience, but also in my communities. And so I hope we'll talk about that later too. So Ted, we'll finish with a reading from the conclusion. We're really excited to hear what our fellow panelists have to offer to this conversation. So Ted.
As of winter 2022, there are 38.4 million people across the globe living with HIV. More than 84 million people have been diagnosed with HIV since records of the sort started to be kept. These large-scale numbers, built one by one from the loss and suffering of individuals and their communities, are a reminder that before HIV is an era of study or a focus of culture or a matter of conversation, it is a material bodily reality. HIV lives in some people's bodies and not in others. In some communities, in greater numbers than others, and in some regions or places where it amplifies incredible stress upon already weakened systems. There are different costs and different experiences of any one diagnosis. Viruses are themselves rooted in a formulative system of bias and deprivation dependent on gender, sexuality, geography, and much more.
As of now, there's no cure for HIV, although there is medical treatment developed decades into its history with its own costs and benefits. HAART can severely reduce the burden of the virus on a person's body, but AIDS is not over. Regardless of pills, cures, or vaccines, HIV disproportionately taxes some humans' daily lives due to systemic injustice and is suffered disproportionately through stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. For these violations, there is also no cure, only treatment through culture.
We are not comfortable with popular public health and wellness campaign rhetorics that work towards goals like being HIV-free, or ending AIDS. We are sensitive to what such terms mean for all people who have ever lived with HIV. We know these terms discount the experiences of people currently living with the virus. They ignore people who will get a positive diagnosis in the future. However, we also understand and support the hope behind the words. One day, the crisis of AIDS will be over. And in that time of AIDS, no AIDS, there will be no more diagnosis, no more stigma. Suffering with HIV will end. The times of AIDS will be over. And at the time of no AIDS, what we will have, what we will remain, we will keep as ours, to keep, save, and share. And that will be power, knowledge, art, and connection that we've accrued across the waves of viral and linked crises encountered by our bodies, in our communities, in our cultural production, and in time. Others will be able to use this.
Until AIDS is over, acts and processes of attention, connection, healing, and empowerment that have been refined over the times of this crisis can and should be used now. Our book tries to learn from, engage in, and model the best of such practices honed from our noble traditions, some of which we have named ourselves and which we share with the hopes of propagating more. When AIDS is over, the book and all of the remarkable objects and processes which we discuss in it will remain as a useful guide to how humans struggle to save themselves and each other. The times of AIDS and this conversation about it are processes for interactive engagements with cultural artifacts from the past and present of AIDS, aimed at saving ourselves and bettering our world. We invite you to join us in this conversation now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and the beautiful words at the end, and the history and the provocation and the inspiration that you just shared with us. Thank you. We turn now to Lori Novak, who has also been a cultural producer of the invisible condition that many people suffer throughout the world, that she has suffered since she was a child, and that again has no common shape or a visual object attached. Lori has taken this as one of her projects in the Migraine Register, which she will tell us about. Lori Novak's photo-based works, installations, and web projects use various technologies of representation to explore issues of memory and transition, identity and loss, presence and absence, shifting cultural meanings of photographs, and the relationship between the intimate and the public. She has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowships, an NEA Fellowship, a Lourdes Comfort Tiffany Foundation grant, and residencies at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, the Bogliasco Center in Italy, Artsway in England, McDowell, Yaddo, and the Girassi Foundation. Her web project from 1996 to the present, collectedvisions.net, explores how family photographs shape our memory and was one of the earliest interactive storytelling sites. Her works have been in numerous national and international exhibitions, including right now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where one of her photographs is currently on view in the exhibition Ourselves, Photographs by Women Artists from Helen Kornblum, which will be up at MoMA until October 10th. Lori, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Alex and Ted. That was really important. Okay, let's start here. I wake up in a fog. It takes me a minute to recognize the familiar pain in my head. It is not throbbing, but more like a slightly pulsing ache. I'm dissociated from my body, as if I am shrunken deep inside. I feel as if I am pinned to the bed, unable to move, even to reach over to take the injection that is sitting on the nightstand. I try to make myself move, knowing that I should. I distract myself by paying attention to my position so that I can mimic the gesture for the day's photo. I am one of the more than 39 million Americans and 1 billion people worldwide who suffer from migraine, a disabling neurological disease that affects 1 in 5 women, 1 in 16 men, 1 in 11 children. According to the American Brain Association, it is the 3rd most common disease in the world. I was given the diagnosis of migraine at age 8 and have spent most of my life ignoring its impact, minimizing the pain, hiding my condition, carrying on and refusing to let the pain stop me, taking what I'm sure was too much Excedrin, numbing myself watching TV, and not recording the frequency of attacks were my means of coping. All my attempts at record keeping failed. That changed in 2009 when I started to photograph myself each time I had a migraine attack. The cameras in my laptop and phone have literally become the mirrors in which I can witness my pain. I set on a quest to visualize the unseen in order to reverse the invisibility of an invisible illness and hopefully change the narrative around chronic illness, especially for women. In many of my art projects throughout my career, I have used my self-image as a device to look at the world and how we understand photography. Now I reverse the point of view and turn my camera inward to understand the complete version of me, the one who lives with migraine. Misuse of terminology around migraine acts to it being misunderstood. Migraine is a neurological disease with different symptoms, including, but not limited to, moderate to severe throbbing head pain, sensory sensitivity, nausea, vomiting, vertigo, brain fog, fatigue, and mood changes. It is not just a headache. The parallels to long COVID and autoimmune diseases and other invisible conditions are many. There's actually no such thing as a migraine. It is not a noun. Just like asthma, it is a condition with attacks and episodes. I feel like I'm fighting a prolonged war with an army of migraine demons in my head ready to pounce at any time. It often feels that I've trained my thoughts to wiggle through the spaces between the pain in my head in order to get out. What I remember being told when I was a child and a teen was that I worried too much, was an overachiever. That's what high-achieving girls were called back then, and was just too stressed out. The denial was painful. It's impossible for me to know what triggers my migraine episodes. I rarely get an aura. Weather is a factor, but unpredictable in knowing how it will affect me. I know that if I skip a meal, get dehydrated, or drink wine, I will bring on an attack. I watch my diet carefully, but I've never been able to follow the advice of developing a regular sleep pattern. After determining that my condition was not life-threatening, my otherwise attentive and supportive parents were emotionally unable to properly attend to my migraine condition. I had an unsolvable problem. something that my dad's flowcharts of pros and cons couldn't solve. My mother consoled me when I vomited, bought Excedrin in bulk, and made sure I never ran out. More than that was just too much for her. Although my pediatrician, who I saw from birth until college, was able to correctly diagnose me, his yearly notes that my mother sent to me reveal that he was convinced that the headaches were caused by allergies. No treatment advice is given, and some years the word migraine does not even appear. So I learned to self-meditate and keep the frequency of my headaches to myself, and more significantly, keep their impact from myself. Hiding my condition, however, also made me feel like I had some power. I did not want to be underestimated or not invited. I wanted to be the one to decide what I could and could not do. I remember very little about my history with migraine, and because I kept my secret so well, there's no one to ask. In my late 20s, I finally saw a neurologist for the first time. Years and years of specialists and alternative practitioners followed, but that is a saga for another time. My friend, the writer Susan J. Miller, told me soon after we met in the late 1970s that if I ever hid the fact that I had a migraine attack when we were together, she would consider it a breach of our friendship. To this day, it is the most shocking thing that anyone has ever told me. Susan is working with me on this project, and I'd like to read a short passage that she wrote. There was, therefore, a separation between how she felt and how she behaved, a disconnect between physical pain and action and demeanor, a process of mastery, the acquisition of a skill. She was very good at it. She had that ability and used it. She was not in denial. That would have been impossible. What she could do was not let on to others that at that moment, in a restaurant, in a class, at a party, on the phone, that she was in the midst of one that was pretty mild or moderate or bad. Her functioning normal self was not a false self exactly, but it was not a full self. Just as the self in pain was neither false nor full. I turned to my old journals for clues. February 1985. I don't know what my problem is. I feel so out of it. It's like I'm in a constant daze. I sleep late. I can only handle a certain number of things each day, and I have this constant urge to just lay in bed and watch TV. I want my old self back. I feel that feeling I discussed in therapy, that I drive myself crazy to get everything done. Of course, I now know what my problem was, and the old self I yearned for was actually one without migraine. I find a journal from 1989 detailing my trip to Italy and France. To my surprise, I actually recorded my migraine struggle, 17 attacks from July 3rd to July 30th. That is 17 out of 27 days. But I kept the details separate, recording the migraine attacks in the back of the book, while in the front, I kept a normal travel journal. There it is, trying my hardest to keep my migraine in its place, away from what I thought was the real me. April 2003, Merida, Mexico. Bad M this morning. Third really bad one that I've woken up with here and had to take a shot, codeine, etc. 2 headache-free, drug-free days though. Stomach still off. My body is feeling like my enemy again. I realize how hard this my body is. As much as I have acknowledged it, I feel like I haven't. I pretend to be normal. I had been photographing myself for 5 years before I actually counted how many attacks I was getting per year. I did periodic checks for my doctor, but that was it. I see now how scared I was to really know. Even though I had launched my website, migraineregister.net, in 2014, I still was avoiding knowing. In early 2015, I counted, and there it was, evidence of 122 attacks. I look at this grid now, and I can see myself sobbing in the shower later that day, overwhelmed by the weight of the knowledge before me. At age 60, I finally faced the facts. I perform wellness more often than I like to admit. I'd be lying if I said, even with all this knowledge, I take into account how much time I might lose, collapsed by migraine when I make plans. A marker in my struggle is early 1999 when this article appeared on the cover of Newsweek. I was in my 40s, and for the first time, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt before. The first acute medication specifically for migraine, known as triptans, had recently come on the market. Sumatriptan, thankfully, worked for me. Botox injections were soon added to my mix. Although the frequency of attacks remained, the severity was brought under control. These are expensive medications, and if I did not have the health insurance that I have, I would not have been able to lead the life I live. Chronic migraine, which means getting 15 or more migraine attacks a month, was not recognized as a disease in the International Classification of Headache Disorders until 2004. I became chronic sometime in the 1980s. I remember doctors telling me it was impossible that I was getting as many migraine episodes as I claimed. I felt like I was a child again, being told I had sinus headaches as a way of explaining away the pain and delegitimizing what I was feeling. I am a member of what Megan O'Rourke calls the invisible kingdom of chronic illness. I honor the long history of women who suffered in silence from migraine, chronic pain, and other invisible illnesses and were not believed, were told they were too emotional, who were committed to institutions, or in the worst cases, killed themselves, or simply whose unacknowledged illnesses stopped them from leading full lives. Here is a list that speaks for itself. In 1984, I went to a doctor who performed biofeedback and hypnosis. After biofeedback did not help me, he convinced me to try hypnosis. What follows is a record of my first session. He asked me to watch a play about my headaches. I saw myself entering a theater with red seats. I sat down and the curtain rose. Act 1, I saw my bedroom in our second home where I lived when I was 11 to 16 years old. There was a clear picture of the room, the 2 twin beds separated by a corner table, the blue and green flowered bedspread, the blue faux French provincial furniture. The shutters were closed, and in bed, a little girl lay curled up in pain. A woman came in and sat down on the bed and comforted the little girl. They just sat there, neither moved. I began to cry, more like sobbing. I felt like if I would let myself, the crying would be uncontrollable. All the tears I never shed about my headaches. The curtain went down. Count backwards, he said, from 5, and the curtain will rise again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Act 2. A family is eating dinner. The surroundings and people are not my family, but I know it represents them. Everyone is chattering away and passing dishes back and forth. I cannot hear what they are saying, but I know it's lively. The action doesn't change and my tears subside. The curtain goes down again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Act 3. I see a man and a woman. They are in a TV sitcom setting, a living room. The man is sitting on the couch reading the newspaper, and the woman is puttering around. It is not my parents. It's the media image I grew up with of the mother and father. The scene abruptly shifts and I'm back in my bedroom. The tears start. Now I see the girl back in bed, very alone in pain. I'm sobbing again. She wants someone to come in and comfort her. No one does, and she can't ask for help. I sob because I know this was me. The scene stays, and I cry until the curtain goes down. Now I'm told I will see something that will help me figure out how to get rid of my headaches. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The curtain goes up. I see my friends. The image is very fuzzy. Then I see Susan and Melissa very clearly. They are my friends that have helped and comforted me the most. They made me feel safe enough to ask for help, and they answered. Not long ago, I had a vision of a bed, like a bed of nails, but with discarded medication containers instead of spikes. So I made this sculpture of a bed with 575 empty sumatriptan cartridges, each of which holds 2 shots. The bed is lined with evidence of 1,150 of my attacks. For 4 years, I've been taking one of the CGRP inhibitors, the first class of drugs created to prevent migraine episodes. The shift in the frequency and severity has been dramatic. I can go 1 to 2 weeks without an attack, which until I started these drugs felt impossible. I am now living more of the life I always pretended that I had. August 2021, Martha's Vineyard. Woke with my head throbbing. My friends went ahead to the beach, brought back all I missed out on, gave myself an injection, drank some coffee, and left as soon as I could. Did yoga and felt like crying quite a bit. I feel like I am in mourning for all I couldn't do because of migraine. It is stating the obvious that our healthcare system in the US has failed us. More specialists are needed to deal with the millions who live with chronic pain and fatigue and undiagnosed conditions. More research funding and patient-centered approaches are also desperately needed. General practitioners are ill-equipped, as long COVID has made abundantly clear. I want to end by reading an excerpt from Joan Didion's brilliant 1968 essay, In Bed. It is a text about her struggle with migraine, where she gives voice to her pain. Reading this essay in my late 20s contributed to my opening up to myself, as well as inspired this project. The physiology error called migraine is, in brief, central to the given of my life. When I was 15, 16, even 25, I used to think I could rid myself of this error by simply denying it. Character over chemistry. Do you have headaches sometimes? Frequently? Never? The application forms would demand. Check one. Wary of the trap, wanting whatever it was the successful circumnavigation of that particular form would bring, a job, a scholarship, the respect of mankind and the grace of God, I would check one. Sometimes I would lie. That, in fact, I spent 1 or 2 days a week almost unconscious with pain, seemed a shameful secret evidence, not merely of some chemical inferiority, but of all my bad attitudes, unpleasant tempers, wrong think. Thank you.
Wow, Laurie, thank you very much. Such powerful images, and it's so interesting. You share with us so generously your struggle to see yourself. And in that, you allow us to see you and us to see ourselves, and you help create the being in community that Alex and Ted are talking about as the precious and vital heritage of all of this suffering and future horizon of something better. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you mentioned Megan O'Rourke, and
Yeah.
we're delighted and privileged to have her here to talk with us today in this discussion. Megan O'Rourke is a writer, a poet, and editor. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, which has just been longlisted for the National Book Award. She is also the author of the best-selling memoir, The Long Goodbye, and poetry collection, the poetry collection's Sun in Days, which was named a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year. Once, another book of poems, and Half-Life, yet another, which was a finalist for the Patterson Poetry Prize and Britain's Forward First Book of Prize. O'Rourke has received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Whiting Notification Award, the May Sarton Poetry Prize, the Union League Prize for Poetry from the Poetry Foundation, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. She's currently here at Yale as the editor of the Yale Review. She began her career as a fiction and nonfiction editor at the New Yorker. Since then, she's been culture editor and literary critic for Slate, as well as the poetry editor and advisory editor for the Paris Review. Her essays, criticism, and poems have appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, Slate, Poetry, the Kenyon Review, and Best American Poetry, among others. She is a graduate of Yale University, where she also teaches and where my administrator remembered her from the English department. Thank you for coming.
Oh, how nice. What was your administrator's name?
Susan Shand.
Oh, yes. Oh my God. How wild. I'm having a little bit of a sunshine moment. I hope you can see me okay. I know I'm kind of backlit by sun, but I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Laura, for inviting me to this really remarkable roundtable, and to the others for presenting their work. I'm almost indecently happy to be inside talking about illness on a beautiful fall day. But this feels like the kind of community and kind of conversation that I think I wrote The Invisible Kingdom, hoping to be part of and hoping to foster in the realm of what are often called complex chronic illnesses or poorly understood chronic illnesses. So I'm gonna, I don't really have slides, but I have a few images to share with you, and I'm gonna sort of read and talk, not too long. Why don't I share my screen? Let's see, can you see this? A wonderful undergraduate put it together for me some while ago, so it's got her touch more than mine. But I began writing The Invisible Kingdom out of a desire to understand my own story. I got mysteriously sick when I was quite young, and realizing that the only way I could tell my story was also by telling a historical, cultural, sociological story. So let me read and talk a little bit, but the way the book begins is by saying that, you know, the stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen, the doctor's call, right? These are the tropes of a kind of sudden illness narrative. But I like to say that I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. So there's different ways I can tell my own story. One is to say I got sick right after graduating from Yale in the late 1990s, when I began experiencing dizziness, chronic pain, drenching night sweats, bouts of fatigue, long before any doctor I saw believed I was sick. Another way to tell this story would be to say that the illness really took hold in the months after my mother died on Christmas Day of 2008, when I caught a virus and suddenly grew more tired than I had ever been, and a fatigue that persisted for a year. My lymph nodes ached. I started to have brain fog and memory problems. And yet another way to say it would be to say it started even years later, when I was traveling with my husband in January of 2012 and noticed a rash on my arm. And we were sitting on the beach reading, and I remember having this question pop up into my head, which was, what was the message? I thought, what is the message of that rash? Which on the face of it is actually a quite strange question to ask about a physical symptom. But in the end, it turned out to be kind of prescient and deeply connected to the book I'm writing. I'm not writing anymore. I did write it. Just it feels like I'm still writing it every day. So really trying to answer that question, what was the message of this physical symptom, became the object of a 10-year quest. In the grips of a malaise I had no name for, and meeting with dismissal from medical professionals as I was in ever more suffering, I needed understanding, and I turned to literature, science, philosophy, doctors, healers, historians, researchers, and other patients. I interviewed close to 100 people living with contested or poorly understood chronic illnesses, and tried to understand a question that was haunting me, which was, why in our hyper-diagnostic age was it so hard for me and many others like me to get a diagnosis, or indeed any recognition of our suffering at all. Along the way, in my own experience, which lasted something like 15 years before I got a diagnosis, so that is 15 years that I was living with symptoms, undiagnosed and alone, I became interested in the contradictions and complexities of our medical system and the obstacles faced by patients whose illnesses are poorly understood, and in the question of what might help me live with illness, even if I could not overcome it. And while there was no single answer, one thing stood out above all, that I wanted recognition of my experience, of the reality of my experience, not least so that others might in the future suffer less than I did. And I will just take you to this illness as metaphor, because this is the state that I lived in for more than a decade, which is this idea that the mysterious symptoms you have are necessarily, or seemingly mysterious, I should say, are necessarily somehow the consequence of a psychological reality. So this Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor, is a kind of parent book to my book. And she says something very important in that book, which is, first, nothing is more punitive than to give a disease a meaning, that meaning being invariably a moralistic one. And also theories that diseases are caused by mental states and can be cured by willpower are always an index of how much is not understood about the physical terrain of a disease. Let me go back. I'll just go back to that for now. So in my own case, that desire to get away from illness as metaphor and toward, can you see this? Yeah. And toward what I'm describing as recognition of the reality of my experience was really important to me, because I wanted human ingenuity to be applied to my condition. Again, not just for myself, but for others, so that we all might suffer less, right? And right now there are a lot of people suffering, as we've just heard so eloquently. We are all familiar with the ubiquity of long-term illnesses like heart disease and cancer, which are well-defined and viewed as unquestionably real, I put that in quotes, even if much remains to be learned about them. But what is less well known, or certainly was until the advent of long COVID, and is still contested, is that there's what I call a silent epidemic of chronic illnesses that are often marginalized, contested, or even unrecognized altogether. And I characterize this group, or the group I'm most interested in, are illnesses that include autoimmune diseases, myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as it was formerly called, MECFS, or the acronym you will see frequently, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, or chronic Lyme disease, as many patients or people living with it call it, dysautonomia, which is a disorder of the autonomic nervous system, actually implicated in long COVID, mast cell activation syndrome, fibromyalgia, and now on a scale that is only beginning to be recognized, long COVID. So if every age has its representative signature disease, as Sontag argued, I contend that this type of chronic illness is ours. And the reason for that is that I see these as conditions in which we find pointedly reflected back at us habits of thought that reveal key cultural assumptions. Those assumptions having, I'll dig into in a second, but having to do with the idea that illnesses should be able to be measured easily, that they should look replicable in others, and that we should be able to help fix them. Those are the kinds of illnesses we like. I contend. So these conditions that I talk about are of course distinct from one another, but they are often characterized by dysregulation of the immune system and or the nervous system, which are powerfully intertwined in our bodies. And some researchers suggest that there may be meaningful overlap in how these illnesses work and in who has them. Which means that you could be someone who has 2 to 3 to 4 diagnoses, which raises all kinds of questions about your reliability. The more diagnoses you have, my research suggested, and my experience suggested, the more suspect you become as a testifier to the reality of your own experience. These are conditions that modern medicine knows surprisingly little about, and that evidence suggests can be triggered by multiple causes, including the body's response to infections. I'm just going to go forward here. The category is growing in size. To take one example, autoimmune diseases are rising at what scientists call epidemic rates. They now affect from 24 million to 50 million people in the United States. When I got acutely sick in 2012, such illnesses were poorly studied and rarely discussed, and often seen as manifestations of underlying mental illness. So marginalized patients who felt mysteriously unwell had to band together into activist groups to try to legitimize their suffering. So you couldn't, before you got treatment, you had to get legitimization of the condition itself. A decade later, as I finished the book in the middle of the pandemic, things looked a little different. So autoimmune disease is now more of a mainstream subject. I think more people now know that in autoimmunity, it's when the body's immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own tissues. It is very clearly a medical reality that we understand now, but because there is a lot we still don't know about it, and tests sometimes don't catch autoimmune disease until it's fairly progressed in some cases, it often gets read metaphorically, right? So what happens is that this other definition of autoimmune disease that I've given you, the failure of the immune system to distinguish between self and non-self, gets pulled into the kind of narrativizing of the illness in such a way that even people with autoimmune disease themselves, who know that they have a genetic tendency, who know that it's running in their family, were telling me stories about how in some way they had brought the autoimmunity onto themselves, right? Which is to say that autoimmunity lends itself to metaphor because we like to imagine that it is somehow that the state of our valiant defender, our immune system attacking us, is somehow a referendum on us as an individual rather than an example of social conditions that have led to the rise of autoimmune disease. And I will show you quickly. These are some autoimmune diseases. This is a not very accurate slide, but you know, the general trajectory you see is upward since 1950. That is true. This gives you a little sense of autoimmune disease. And what we know is that although the people I interviewed saw their autoimmune disease as being a sign that they were living an inauthentic life, that their self was at war with itself, we actually know that autoimmune disease is triggered partly by what we call environment. So it seems to be 1/3 genetic, 2/3 environmental. Environment can include everything from viruses or infections. So we are looking at sort of post-COVID autoimmunity too. The advent of more pollutants in our environment, 100,000 man-made chemicals since World War II, altered microbiome, effects of processed food, more salt, fewer quote unquote good bacteria in our guts, epigenetics or inheritable changes of gene expression, or this idea of the hygiene hypothesis that we have less exposure to antigens, things that stimulate us, our system. So, you know, one of the things I look at in the book are what I call these, I ask the question of why was it so hard for me in our hyperdiagnostic age where you can get a diagnosis of ice cream headache, right? Why, when I was incredibly sick, could I, and again, many of the people I interviewed, not get a diagnosis, not receive a diagnosis? So one of the answers I come to is that it's because we tend to conceptualize disease in one of three ways. The first being a disease that is a specific disease entity, as it's called often, smallpox, influenza, SARS-CoV-2. Another being, number three, being a disease on the other side of the spectrum that's what we call all in your head, such as hypochondria, what we think of as Munchausen's by proxy. So, you know, this basically a hypochondriacal condition that is, you know, mostly in your head or triggered, really just anxiety manifesting as concern about the body. And then the kinds of illnesses that I'm writing about and interested in tend to be diseases and conditions that are definitely considered physiologically real, like autoimmune disease, but that we know can be shaped by biography. So I give the example here of a panic attack or stress. And part of what I talk about in the book is that we have this whole cluster of diseases that are shaped by things like stress and biography, and hard to measure. And that makes them very easy to psychologize or to read, I think, incorrectly in many cases as somatoform disorders or disorders of conviction of the mind rather than the body. So the book aims to understand and reframe the ways we think about this silent epidemic, since we are living through, as I just indicated, what fairly might be called an epidemic rise of immune-mediated complex illness, and now including, this was true even before long COVID, and now we're adding this incredible scope of long COVID to the mix. And yet our medical understanding of such conditions lags far behind where it could be. Because again, the immune system and nervous system are intimately connected in these ways we're just beginning to understand. They're often highly responsive to things like stress and environment and again, biography. And so one of the things I contend and try to grapple with in the book that I think is of urgent importance in thinking about long COVID, which I write about, is the limits of measurement-based medicine, right? We need measurement-based medicine, but what happens when you have a number of people, a lot of people, millions of people, whose bodies live at the edge of medical knowledge? How do we deal with that uncertainty? They also reveal the limits, or the pathologies rather, associated with American individualism, our discomfort with what John Keats, the poet, the Romantic poet, who himself died of tuberculosis, once called, quote, being in uncertainties. In the end, the epidemic of these illnesses is a stark reminder of our social and environmental interconnectedness. When the poet John Donne wrote, "No man is an island," that famous text we've all heard, certainly that line, he wrote it when he was ill with an infectious illness in 1623, listening for the bells that would show that his daughter had been married. He wanted to get her married so that he could die knowing that she was taken care of. And so he was lying in his isolated hospital bed, listening to all these bells in the middle of a pandemic, indicating the deaths of many and the beginnings of weddings, the beginnings of maybe his daughter's life. And so lying there alone, he came to think about the way, is illness in fact an individual experience or a social experience? And he comes to write "No man is an island," offering a potential framework for how we might come to think of what the immune system suggests illness really is, right? The immune system is a defense system that actually leaves our bodies porously open to one another, as the current coronavirus has starkly reminded us, right? My actions affect your health, affect your grandparents' health, affect your child's health. So we each have our own highly personalized immune system, but it is shaped by our history of interactions with others, the history of viruses and pathogens we've experienced, the history of our exposure to toxicity, the history of our exposure to social stressors such as poverty, trauma, race, and more. So the kind of crux, and I'll say a few more things and stop, but the crux of the question I'm interested in is how can you explain and identify your suffering when no one has a name for it? We don't know how to measure and see it when we live in an invisible kingdom. And how do you live with an illness that is seen as your problem as an individual when in fact it's very much, if not triggered by, part of our existence in a social sphere, right? So I'm trying to offer context in the book for why these syndromes have been hard to diagnose and treat, and how they challenge existing frameworks to the extent that they're sometimes called invisible illnesses, as we just heard from Lori. And really my hope is to revolutionize care and attitudes toward people whose experiences have long been stigmatized, because as I argue in the book, we are members of an invisible kingdom. So we might be invisible on our own, but when you take the collective, and we're seeing this with long COVID, change starts to become possible. But we have to tell a very untidy story, I think, for that change to be possible. We have to resist the tidiness of most illness narratives, and we have to think about chronicity and that which can't be fixed or overcome, and live in the space of that uncertainty and complexity. And we do need to know and articulate that to have a poorly understood disease in particular is to be brought up against every flaw in the US healthcare system. It's to collide with the structural problems of a late capitalist society that values productivity more than health, and to confront the philosophical problem of conveying an experience that lacks an accepted framework. And I'm just going to show you that. Great. You can see this, I hope, and only you can hear this whistle to the dog. Yes, indeed, only the dog can hear the whistle. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I think we're moving to, and long COVID is helping us move to something I lay out in the book, which is kind of moving away from the idea that germ theory brought us that all bodies should behave the same way in response to a pathogen, and toward a more current idea that the immune system is very individual, of course, and that its response to a pathogen can be individual and different. And some people can be made sick in a long-term way, if not a permanent way, by their exposure to a pathogen at the wrong moment. And so this personalized view of illness brings us to a more complex one. But of course, one of the problems we face is that overwhelmingly, it tends to be women who are experiencing these conditions, including autoimmune disease. And even with long COVID, we see that it's happening more frequently in women, and women are tending to be dismissed by doctors. So the philosopher Miranda Fricker uses the term testimonial injustice to describe prejudice against a group that unfairly undermines the credibility of an individual within it. She calls it a distinctive kind of injustice because it undermines the speaker's capacity specifically as, quote, a giver of knowledge. So one of the things I write about that's a special pain of living with these kinds of conditions and with long COVID is that in many cases, when you go to a GP who says, I don't believe in long COVID, as I'm reporting on people telling me this is happening to them, you are rendered effectively unable to provide knowledge about your condition and relegated to a feedback loop in your own mind. At the very moment that we're seeing, and what my own experience of being ill taught me, is that our bodies may feel autonomous, but we live in the nexus of a kind of radical interconnection. So these conditions point, are born of individual difference, but point to the need for social solutions, right? Social collective safety nets and recognition fundamentally of our interconnectedness. Long COVID is impacting as many as 1 in 5 people, according to various numbers. The numbers look really different depending how we define long COVID, but we have not yet reckoned with the ways in which we'll further health inequities that already exist. We need to move forward thinking about the fact that our immune system is responsive to the emotions and affects and healthcare policies and social policies and chemical regulation policies of others. And think about who gets to access healthcare, and especially healthcare at the leading edge of medical knowledge. If the immune dysregulated body is an embodiment of our porousness to one another, it is rather an embodiment of our porousness to one another. And so we need to recognize that and make policy and make narratives around that. This coronavirus pandemic and the devastation it has brought with it has made this clearer than ever. But it was always true. And I'll just leave you with this wonderful image. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You talk about the need to resist tidy narratives. It's very striking. And I don't think anybody spoke in a tidy fashion. I don't know tidy. And I don't think it doesn't feel tidy, but it feels urgent to refuse the tidy narrative. That is, so many people have said to me recently, oh, I had COVID, like it was nothing. It's over, it's done, get over it. It's a soft landing. The pandemic is over, without looking at the trailing threat, which is the messy part of yes, I got better from COVID. Well, but there's another shoe to fall. The room is a mess. And it's really clear that you all have such powerful ways of pointing to this untidy narrative that we have to start to tell. It's interesting. I thought it was very interesting, Alex and Ted, that you felt at the beginning of COVID, and I remember this from talking to Alex, that people were saying, oh, well, now I get it about HIV. What is like HIV? How is COVID like HIV? And your answer, which is so terrific, was it's not the same virus, but it's the same fight. It's the fight to make cultural production. It's the fight to produce the images that will allow us to change the rules of the living that you are each so eloquently showing these interconnections on an untidy but urgent matter. So thank you very, very much. If anybody in the audience has questions for the panel, you could put them in the Q&A, and Aylin will recognize them and ask them. But I would like to ask the panel to begin, if you can say one thing about your own work that seems to have been shored up by the work of the other that you just heard. What of your own work was helped by the work of the others that you just heard?
Well, you have to imagine that Ted and I are back channeling, because we are. And one of the things that we said, so you don't have to imagine it, I'm telling you. One of the things that we said, Megan, is that Ted texted me, your use of the silent epidemic of chronic illness is in some really interesting conversation with our thinking about silence and epidemics. And then I wrote back, oh no, this is super interesting. We need to think about it some more. And I'm not ready to do that. But I think that the role of silence that is also in Lori's work, the role of knowing internally a reality, and for AIDS, it is a different viral illness. It is not the same thing as disability, is not the same thing as chronic illness. But one of the things that long COVID and COVID have done is ask us to be in a room together and start to map these intersections and differences, and the intersection differences about something that is uncountable, because viral illnesses are countable, something that is unseeable. Now that's different for HIV/AIDS. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not, etc. But this question of moving in and out of visibility and externalizing and organizing around the truth of your experience of an illness in a community, it ripples across all of them. And I would imagine, and I would love to hear from you all, I think the differences may be more important than the similarities. Mm-hmm. And so, the specificity of, HIV being attached to gay men, hemophiliacs and drug users in the beginning is what starts its story moving forward, whereas the story of migraine may start and move forward differently, metaphorized differently, and Megan as well, your chronic illness. So again, this question of silence looms large in the room, but also of breaking silence, obviously.
I really loved what you said about that silence, that you were thinking of silence as the connection between the silences, like that it's not like, there's like a lot of us aren't being silenced, but there's silence. So I'm thinking about the spaces in between. And my book of Megan's is so marked up that I could go on and on about, but I just have to say that when I opened it, in getting ready for this talk, thinking of what fell out, Megan, was this little card that says, quoting you, "It is unbearable, and yet I bear it."
Yeah, I related to so much. Related is both too weak and too dimensional a word in a way, but let's say I felt actually so much of what you were saying, Lori, about migraine and the kind of looking back and accounting, the counting and realizing how much there is of it, that's something I think about a lot as someone with conditions that are chronic, right? And I was thinking too in your talk that part of, I loved the holding on to the radical and the worrying about the thinking about, a goal certainly of mine has been to kind of foreground and in some ways normalize, right, the story of poorly understood illnesses so that we have a framework. But I took so much from the thinking about, well, what do we have to hold on to the radical and make space for the radical within that, because I do think that there's something about chronicity in general and that which does not resolve, which maybe is one unifying factor here among many differences. But that there is something radical in our, kind of normatively narrativized brains of, struggle, dissent, overcoming, right? That there's something that just remains radical about that, which cannot be kind of,
Yeah.
In the Q&A, people are asking if you know of anything that's happening tying you all together, tying together all of these elements. Thank you so much for this moving and energizing panel. This is from Stephanie Jensen Moulton. What might be a synthesizing message from this panel to, for instance, an undergraduate humanities course with regard to intersectional chronic COVID activism? What a wonderful intersectional chronic COVID activism.
Well, I mean, Stephanie, this organizing is happening right now. And one of the things that has been remarkable, and I think you hear it in all of the conversations, that people are coming to the table who have not been sure that it's okay to do so in relation from disability justice, from HIV, specifically long COVID and ME/CFS and other chronic illnesses, because we have so much to learn from each other. And the things that we have to learn to each other are scientific. They are about patient-led activism and patient-led demands, but they also are about, these ideas that have been resonating about who is believed, and that especially come up, well, both Megan and Lori's. So to be in a room with people that believe you, that honor your suffering, that aren't trying to make you better necessarily, but will sit with you and learn from resonances across chronicity, I think is what's happening when those groups are coming to the table. And they're coming to the table around long COVID because it's so visible and there's money for it, by the way.
I think that's the really big difference here is there is money for long COVID and there was not money for ME/CFS and these other things. So I think in terms of that intersectional part of what I'm seeing is that what has been amazing about the early long COVID activists is that they're very eager to learn from ME/CFS activists, HIV activists. So there's this real rise in, it's kind of like a tide of activism that feels like it's lifting so many different areas of people living with illness who want to center in medical research and conversation, the patient experience, and to be able to have, and that's something I do think, I know quite consciously, some of us, some people are looking to HIV activists too, right, as models for how do we say patients need access to treatment, right?
In the chat, I put some links to some of the amazing people that Alex and I get to be in community with, who are people from the AIDS response who are building upon that to do all the work that we're talking about here. And again, kind of inspired by all this, I'm also interested in the difference between HIV and all the other illnesses we're talking about. Megan, you talked about the unknowingness of these illnesses, and HIV is very much in a different space. There's still so much to learn about it, but there is so much knowledge around it. So I just wanted to just mark that so we don't take that for granted, or I don't take that for granted.
And also what I would really hone in on with undergraduates in humanities classes is the function of stigma, which is a word we haven't used yet, but is kind of bracketing all of the experiences. Why do cultures write stigma onto some experiences of some bodies, and how do you unmake stigma? And for most of us in HIV, it's been a 40-year-old conversation about stigma. not the only conversation. And I hear stigma in slightly different words in Lori's and Megan's responses. And self-representation is fundamental to the unmaking of stigma, to say, like, I'm here, I have long COVID right now. It's okay to say it. We can hold that, but Lori, so much of what is moved by in your work was the pretending not to have it. And that weight. And I thought that was beautiful in your presentation.
I mean, there's like, which, with anything, I think I can talk about my migraine for hours with people, but to admit that I have one when I'm sitting with you, is another thing,
Yeah. I mean, I think I said stigmatize, and my whole book is about, I think, this question of feeling stigmatized and what that means, and what it means in particular. And I think it's so important to keep leaning on differences too, because differences are edifying, but on what it does mean when the stigma is that your condition can't be seen, and you, in particular, and this is relevant to long COVID, and actually to the next question in the chat, which is that, some of the symptoms of long COVID, I am currently living with long COVID on top of my previous conditions. It can come and go, so that in that sense, it can be invisible, right? Because you will be functioning one day and not functioning another, but still acting as though you are functioning.
So we've lost Ted because he had to go teach a class. He glided away.
Sadly,
yes, and but I just want to conclude by saying that this to be in this Zoom room together and to have the chance to talk about the intersectionality of our question about, can we go the distance with the virus? That is the distance with the virus, is to learn its intersectionality, both its sameness and its difference, how it lives with this and with that, and intersecting with the other. And perhaps this community, an intersectional community of those who have had the fortitude to live with and the courage to work with and reveal and do politics and activism about these diseases, perhaps this is a community which will have the sensitivity to name the intersections, to be clear about the differences, to be militant about the similarities, and to make something better happen. So the Zip Code Memory Project, and I in particular, but the rest of everybody involved, thanks you very, very much for spending this afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for inviting us, Laura.
Yes, thank you, Laura.